Hello, this is the first review session for AP European History and IB History Year 1. The title of this review session is Great Britain, 1215 through 1815, the Monarchy and the Rivalry with the French. Just to review, Britain's rivalry with the French dates to the occasion when William of Normandy conquered England. At that time, England essentially became part of Normandy, but over time, Normandy came to be considered more like part of England. And the English kings used Normandy as a sort of base of operations to attempt to expand their territories in what is today France. And they did so through conquest and through marriage. Needless to say, as the French monarchy grew in power, they came to see this English presence in what they considered to be their territory as something that they wanted to reverse. And so wars were fought many times between the English and the French over the control of Normandy and the other territories that the English had acquired. It was during one of these wars that Magna Carta was sort of prompted. King John of England was employing his nobles to wage war against the French. Now, this was part of their feudal contract. They were required to provide military service to the king, but the thing was that typically there was a limit on that service, and John repeatedly pushed his nobles beyond their limits. And so finally, in the year 1215, a group of them rebelled. They refused to continue to provide service. John then abused his power further by confiscating their territory and imprisoning them and doing all sorts of nasty things like that. And so the rebellion spread, and eventually John's nobles forced him to sign Magna Carta, which was at that time known simply as the Charter of the Nobles, or Charter of the Barons. And among other things, it required that no Englishman, or rather no English noble, be deprived of his liberty or his property without some sort of fair and just legal proceeding. At that time, it also established the idea that the King of England is not above the law, that even he must obey the law. So Magna Carta was really the first occasion in history, certainly in European history, when a king was forced to admit that his powers were not absolute, and this was the beginning in England of a tradition of having a limited monarchy. I mention these things not because I expect them to show up on the exam as items in and of themselves, but because they are important reference points for things that will show up on the exam. So, for example, there was a long period of warfare between the English and the French, and it was known as the 100 Years' War, although it lasted more than 100 years. It lasted from 1337 until 1453. But the 100 Years' War was triggered by a dispute over the control of the wool trade up in Flanders, which is north of France and today part of Belgium. But in reality, it was simply a continuation of the ongoing war between the English and the French over control of Normandy and the other territories that the English had gained and that the French were trying to take back. The English had an early advantage in the 100 Years' War, largely due to a technology that they had developed, which was the longbow. The longbow was about 6 feet tall and made out of the wood of the yew tree, which is very strong but very flexible. And a longbowman could draw the bowstring all the way back to his ear, and in doing so generate a lot of potential energy in the bow. And so when the string was released, that potential energy was transferred into the arrow, and it drove the arrow forward through the air with a much greater force than arrows had typically been fired in the past. And it allowed English longbowmen to actually pierce the armor of enemy knights. And it meant that an English army made up primarily of peasants could actually go toe-to-toe with a French army of knights and prevail over them. And the most famous case of this was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, in which a whole army of English knights were utterly routed primarily by English longbowmen. And a lot of the early battles of the war went that way, which is why England had an advantage at the beginning of the war. The tide of the war turned famously with the introduction of the 16-year-old Joan of Arc, who inspired the French armies and managed to get the tide of the war turned against the English to some degree by introducing morale to the French that they had not had in some time. And actually, in a way, by demoralizing the English, Joan of Arc was captured after winning several battles, and the English executed her for witchcraft. But during her execution, she was seen to really not suffer from being burned at the stake. And so one English soldier who was present cried out, "We are doomed. We have burned a saint." They believed that God had protected her. And so for many Englishmen, the defeat of Joan of Arc, the death of Joan of Arc, had the opposite purpose that it was supposed to. It was supposed to reduce the morale of the French. Instead, it tended to reduce the morale of the English. They realized, or they thought, that they had killed someone who God had chosen. And by consequence, when they learned of the circumstances of her death, it increased the morale of the French. Now, realistically, the thing that turned the tide of the war, the 100 Years' War, was the introduction of artillery, cannon, on the battlefield by the French. These were big, monstrous devices that had to essentially be cast in place, and you couldn't aim them very well, but it didn't matter because the targets that they were firing at were stationary, and those were English castles. The English had really held the territory that they had claimed by constructing castles, these sort of strong points, and they would garrison these castles with English soldiers, and the English soldiers could sort of move out from the castles to control the territory around. And so the goal of the French in this war became to, and had been, and now increasingly became to knock down these castles. And the introduction of artillery really made the difference there. In the end, the English lost the 100 Years' War and were driven from almost all of their territories in France, with a few minor exceptions. But the 100 Years' War caused enormous upheaval in England. The defeat, in particular, caused upheaval in the form of what became known as the Wars of the Roses. This was a war between two factions of the Plantagenet family, and the Plantagenet family ruled England at this time. The two factions were the faction Lancaster and the faction of York, each represented by a different colored rose, and so this is sort of a civil war, and it was referred to as the War of the Roses. The faction which won was the faction of the Lancaster, the House of Lancaster, at that time led by a man named Henry Tudor, Tudor. And when Henry Tudor gained victory in the Wars of the Roses, he then ascended to the throne of England, and he became known as Henry VII. This was in 1487. It was, however, Henry VIII, the next of the Tudor kings, who was sort of the most famous of them. He ascended to the throne in 1509 and continued in power until 1547. Henry VIII was a great supporter of the Roman Catholic Church at a time when it needed supporters. For example, when Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, had provoked a French invasion of Italy, among those who came to his rescue was Henry VIII. And then during the Reformation, Henry VIII had not only married Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Aragon, who were the royal Catholic majesties of Spain, which is sort of the leading Roman Catholic country of Europe. They considered the standard bearers for Roman Catholicism in Europe. But he had also written, or at least given his name to, a document known as the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. This was an essay in answer to Martin Luther's claim that there were only two sacraments supported by Scripture, and that while some of the others might be favorable to God, only two, baptism and communion, were called for by Christ, and therefore those were the only two really required for salvation. Well, Henry VIII issued this essay that was an answer to that, and really blasted away at Luther. Now, it's very likely that Henry did not himself write this in whole, although he was a quite accomplished and intelligent man, but rather his chief advisor and friend, Sir Thomas More, probably wrote the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Either way, Henry VIII received credit for it, and for his work in support of the Church and its doctrines, was given the title Defensor Fidei, Defender of the Faith. And as a matter of fact, that title was passed down by English monarchs from generation to generation, and is still a part of their title, although England is no longer a Roman Catholic country, primarily. And we'll get to that. Henry VIII, having married Catherine of Aragon, produced a daughter, and her name was Mary. And that was fine, except that following that, it seemed that Catherine could not conceive. And this was a problem, because England had never had a female monarch, and many people believed constitutionally it was not possible to have a female monarch. And so Henry VIII was desperate to produce a male heir. Well, he knew that Catherine's failure to conceive was not his fault. He had, in fact, it appears, impregnated at least one of his mistresses. And so he began to look for a way to get out of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The person in charge of helping Henry with this was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. And the reason why the cardinal had to be brought into this was that the Roman Catholic Church, of which Henry was still a loyal and faithful member, did not simply allow you to divorce your wife. You had to have a special dispensation from the Pope to do so. And in order to earn that special dispensation, you had to demonstrate that biblically something was wrong with the marriage. And so it was up to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey to figure this out. He was the leading churchman of England, and it was thought, the leading biblical scholar. It was his job to find a biblical excuse for getting a divorce. He found one in the book of Leviticus, and it essentially said that if a man lays down with his brother's wife, it is a unclean thing, and they shall be childless. Well, Catherine of Aragon had originally been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who ought to have been king, but who died before he could ascend to the throne. And then Catherine had married Henry. So he had, in fact, laid with his brother's wife. Now, they weren't childless. They had produced a daughter, but in Wolsey's mind, close enough. So the thing was that a divorce here would not do. What Henry needed was an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, because the curse was already on them. He had lain with his brother's wife. They had produced a child. There it was. And so it was important to annul the marriage. So in an annulment, it is as though the marriage never happened. A divorce simply means the marriage happened and now it's over. In an annulment, in the eyes of the church and therefore in the eyes of God, the marriage never happened. And that was the only way to remove the curse of the unclean act of laying with the brother's wife. So this was Wolsey's advice to Henry VIII, and they applied with the Pope for an annulment. The problem was that Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And the thing was that the Pope, Leo X, at this time really needed Charles's help in combating Martin Luther and his followers. And the problem was that Charles was not going to take kindly if the Pope agreed to annul the marriage of his aunt to Henry VIII. They had produced a daughter, which was then Charles's cousin, Mary, and to annul that marriage and leave Catherine sort of unmarried and having technically never been married, but she has a daughter, that would really put her in a very tough position, and it would put Mary in a tough position as well. And so under pressure from Charles V, Leo X refused to grant the request for an annulment. And that was a problem for Henry VIII, because he had already decided upon the woman whom he wanted to marry, and this was 16-year-old Anne Boleyn, who was a member of the royal court. He was quite impressed with her, and given her youth, he expected that he would have no trouble conceiving with her. And so this became a bit of a problem, because he had to await the decision of the Pope. He had to await the annulment in order that he could marry Anne Boleyn and then start working on having a son. When the Pope refused to annul Henry VIII's marriage, Henry VIII was pretty outraged by that. He was, as King of England, used to getting what he wanted. Parliament was largely under his control, and so he typically commanded something and it happened. This was not the case. So, in 1534, Henry VIII called upon his Parliament to pass a law called the Act of Supremacy. So the Act of Supremacy in 1534, it declared that the people of England now belonged to a new church. And this was the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. It essentially separated England from the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore the people of England from the authority of the Pope. In a way, since the Pope would not grant Henry VIII a divorce, he divorced England from the Church, and in its place created the Church of England. Now, the Church of England was in many, many ways a mirror image of the Roman Catholic Church in terms of a lot of its hierarchy and liturgy and traditions. The thing was that there were a few differences. Instead of conducting services in Latin, services were conducted in English. And the head of this church was not the Pope, but rather the king. Now, Henry VIII then, having created his own church and having placed himself at the head of it, moved forward with his plans to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. He granted himself a divorce, which he now could do as head of the church. He no longer had to rely on the biblical justification from Leviticus, which led you down the road to an annulment, because he didn't need to impress the Pope or convince the Pope. He was now, in effect, the Pope, so he just granted himself a divorce. Catherine was well taken care of, and actually she remained in England, and she raised both her daughter Mary and Henry's other daughter Elizabeth. But set that aside for the moment, he then moved forward with his plans to marry Anne Boleyn. The problem with this was that the whole goal of marrying Anne Boleyn was to produce an heir. And the only way that the people of England would accept a son produced in this marriage is if they believed that the marriage was legitimate. And the only way that that would happen is if they believed that the divorce had been legitimate. And the only way that that would happen is if they believed that Henry's authority as head of the church was legitimate. And the only way that they would do that is if they believed that the church itself was legitimate. So the whole thing relied upon people's belief, the people of England's belief, that the church, that they had legitimately been switched from one church to this new church, the Church of England. So Henry VIII required all of the sort of public leaders of the realm to sign a sort of loyalty oath, a document in which they acknowledged the authority of the church and the king's authority as head of the church. And all of the public figures did that, with the exception of, and this was most surprising to Henry, with the exception of his best friend and advisor, Sir Thomas More. More had backed him up on everything. He had, again, probably he had been the author of the defense of the Seven Sacraments. But More had a real problem with what Henry VIII was doing now. More was a devout Roman Catholic. We know that in light of the fact that he had written the defense of the Seven Sacraments in all likelihood. And additionally, More did not believe that a secular leader, a temporal leader, a man with political power only, was qualified to appoint himself as a spiritual leader. He could be the King of England, but he couldn't be the leader of the Church of England. He wasn't qualified. And this was a continuation of the debate that had been going on for some time about the relative authority of secular rulers like princes and kings and emperors and religious leaders, specifically the Pope. It had been a debate that had been going on since the time of Augustine, before the fall of the Roman Empire, and it had continued through a whole series of popes during the medieval era, differences between popes and kings, popes and emperors. And Sir Thomas More believed that there was no qualification that a secular leader had that would allow him to assume spiritual leadership, as Henry VIII did, so he refused to sign. This was a problem for Henry VIII because Sir Thomas was probably the most trusted man in England at that time, and it would be sort of unseemly for Sir Thomas to refuse to support the church that the king had created. And furthermore, he outraged Henry, and more so Anne Boleyn, when he then refused to show up at their marriage. So this created problems, and in the end, Sir Thomas More was arrested. He was asked to explain why he refused to sign the documents. He refused to do that. He wouldn't explain why, because he believed that in doing so, he would leave himself open to charges of treason. He was essentially saying that a law passed by England's Parliament and enacted by the King was not the law. So he refused to explain himself. Didn't matter. They trumped up charges of treason against him anyway, and he was convicted and sentenced to die. And so only then did he then explain his reasons for refusing to sign the document, which is why we know what those reasons were. But Sir Thomas More was then executed, his head struck off with an axe. By the way, he was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church, so he's St. Thomas More today. But anyway, by that time, Henry was already married to Anne Boleyn, and she bore him a beautiful baby daughter, whom they named Elizabeth. And at that point then, she began to show her ugly side. Anne Boleyn, it turns out, was a pretty nasty person. And not only was she sour about the fact that Thomas More had refused to attend their wedding, but Thomas More was originally sentenced to torture followed by execution. And Henry VIII, remembering his friendship with Thomas More, had commuted the sentence down to just execution. And she was so mad at Henry VIII for doing that she didn't speak to him for weeks. So you kind of get a little sense of what kind of person Anne Boleyn was. And in the end, Henry VIII decided he didn't want her anymore, and he had her executed. He married instead then Jane Seymour. And it was Jane Seymour who then produced the son that he was looking for, a boy named Edward. And in 1543, when Edward was born, a law was promulgated through Parliament known as the Act of Succession. And the Act of Succession simply stated, for, I suppose, constitutional clarity, simply stated that when Henry VIII died, Edward would be his successor. It made no mention of the two girls, Mary or Elizabeth, who were, as I mentioned, being raised together, essentially like sisters, by Catherine in an estate provided to her by Henry. But the Act of Succession locked the two girls out. It simply stated that Edward was the successor. Now, Henry VIII went through, by the way, Jane Seymour died shortly after giving birth to Edward as a result of complications related to childbirth. And Henry VIII went through two more wives before finally reaching his sixth. His sixth wife was Catherine Parr, and at one point Henry VIII claimed that she was the only one of his six wives whom he had ever actually loved. But she was very, very influential, and in bringing Henry VIII through the end of his life, she was the one who ultimately persuaded Henry VIII to reconcile with his two daughters, with Mary and with Elizabeth. And under her influence, in 1543, the Act of Succession was revised to include Mary and Elizabeth, so that Edward would remain, although the youngest of the three children, Edward would remain the initial heir to the throne. But the new Act of Succession provided that if Edward could not succeed Henry, or if Edward would then die without producing an heir, Mary would succeed him, and then even it provided that if Mary died without an heir, Elizabeth would succeed her. And in fact, it's a very good thing. The English people could thank Catherine Parr for influencing Henry this way, because in the end they needed all three of them. It turned out that Edward was a very sickly person. He ascended to the throne as a child, and therefore there was a period here of regency. And if you need a review on that, a regency exists when the monarch is not capable of ruling on his own. And so you appoint a regent who rules in place of the monarch. The monarch may be too young, may be too old, may be senile, something like that. And so really, for the entirety of for the entirety of Edward VI's reign as King of England, which lasted from 1547 to 1553, so only 6 years really. It was a regency, and he was a young man. He died ultimately in his teens. He had been sickly from the very beginning. It's unclear exactly what the cause of death was, but really throughout his reign, he could barely even appear in public because he was so feverish and weak. So he died. He died in 1553, and with that, his much older half-sister, Mary Tudor, ascended to the throne. Now, there was a brief period when Mary's cousins, specifically Lady Jane Grey and her husband, Guilford Dudley, attempted to usurp the throne. They asserted their own claim to the throne, and they believed that they had some supporters, and they did have some supporters, but Lady Jane Grey's usurpation lasted only 13 days. Ultimately, that group was rooted out and overthrown, and they were all executed. And Mary took quite intense retribution against that branch of her family, her cousins, and that gained her the nickname Bloody Mary, because she had ordered the executions of her many cousins who had taken part in this attempt to usurp the throne. But Mary, then, was Roman Catholic. Mary Tudor, also known as Mary I, Queen of England. She had been raised Roman Catholic by her Roman Catholic mother, Catherine of Aragon. And that perhaps is part of the reason why others attempted to usurp her throne. By that time, the Church of England had been established for about a generation. It had come into existence in 1534. This is now 1553. So for roughly 20 years it had been in existence and it had been established. People feared that Mary would attempt to restore Roman Catholicism in England. And in fact, she had married Philip II, who was now the King of Spain. He essentially took on that role that had been initiated by Ferdinand and Isabella of making Spain this Catholic standard bearer. And so in marrying Mary, I think there was a thought there that they would produce children and that their children would reign both England and Spain, would rule over both England and Spain, and in that way unite them, and certainly that would be the first step toward restoring England to Roman Catholicism. So if there were those who wished to not see Mary ascend to the throne, it would have been those who were loyal to the Anglican Church and did not want to see Roman Catholicism restored. So Mary was always concerned about the prospect of being overthrown. This led her to imprison her half-sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been raised with her by Catherine of Aragon, essentially as a sister, but Mary didn't feel that she could take any chances. Certainly in the eyes of Anglicans, Elizabeth would be a suitable, although a woman, and Mary was England's first female monarch. Elizabeth would be a suitable replacement because she had been raised Anglican. But Mary Tudor also did not last. She reigned from 1553 to 1558. So again, only 5 years. And she died. She and Philip II never produced any children. And so that whole situation kind of dissipated, except in as much as Philip II then approached Elizabeth. And he essentially said to Elizabeth, I'm claiming my right to marry you. His argument was essentially that in marrying Mary, he had married the Queen of England. And now that Elizabeth was, according to the terms of the Act of Succession, ascending to the throne of England, he was sort of claiming his right to continue that marriage by marrying Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth wasn't that kind of girl. She was not one to be pushed around by anybody, certainly not Philip II. And she utterly rejected this claim, this proposal in the form of essentially a legal claim, and instead ruled for 46 years without marrying anyone. She gets the nickname the Virgin Queen because of this. The assumption in those days being that if you were not married, you remained a virgin. And that's why Virginia, the first English colony in America, is named what it's named. It's named for her. It's named for Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Well, anyway, she was one of the most popular monarchs of Europe, or of English history. She reigned for 46 years. She was known also, as well as the Virgin Queen, she was known as Good Queen Bess by the English people. She was smart, probably smarter than her father, Henry VIII. She was capable in 6 different languages. She was also quite an athlete. Horseback riding, archery, all that stuff, all the things that her father had been good at. And she was in many ways like her father. She was broad-shouldered and had bright red hair, and she had a temper that matched Henry VIII's. She was known to, when she would get angry, she would box the ears of someone. She would clap their ears and compress air inside the eardrums and make them pop. She would throw her shoes at people. So she was temperamental. Nevertheless, to the English people, she was a great hero. Philip II, the King of Spain, became her chief rival, and England and Spain became rivals during her reign as queen. And for a brief time, the English-Spanish rivalry sort of overtook the English-French rivalry as the chief rivalry that the English were dealing with. Spain had established a group of colonies, an empire, really, in the Americas, and they were carting back gold and silver from that empire, and it was really the basis of their economy. There were a group of English sailors, pirates, sort of gentlemen pirates, but pirates, who were known as the Sea Dogs, and they were taking advantage of this trade because the Spanish traded using big ships called galleons. And these galleons, because of their size, and they needed to be big because they were carting back heavy cargo, gold and silver, really. These galleons were slow and very unmaneuverable, and they were easy prey for pirates. And so English pirates known as the Sea Dogs were harassing this trade back and forth from the New World. And indeed, they were being granted sort of safe haven by Elizabeth in English ports, provided that they gave the crown a share of their spoils that they had gained by capturing Spanish galleons. Philip II requested that requested that Elizabeth stop this practice, but Elizabeth refused. And as a matter of fact, she brought in the Sea Dogs, including their leader, Sir Francis Drake, and knighted them. When you knight somebody, when you grant somebody an honorific title, it's a way of saying, great work, keep it up. And far from suppressing the Sea Dogs, Elizabeth honored them with this title. And that's why when you think about Francis Drake, you always have Sir Francis Drake. He got his Sir by doing a good job of harassing Spanish shipping. So clearly, Philip II was quite upset with Elizabeth. She had done all the things he didn't want her to do, and she hadn't done the things he did want her to do. She had refused to marry him. She had knighted the Sea Dogs rather than suppressing them. And then, one more thing. The Netherlands, which was a territory of Spain at that time, was seeing the emergence of Protestantism in the form of the Dutch Reformed Church. And there was rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore against Philip, because Philip was attempting to maintain the supremacy of the Roman Catholic Church there, and not just maintain its supremacy, but to stamp out the emergence of Protestantism. Well, this had led to revolt in the Netherlands against Spanish rule. And Elizabeth intervened in this revolt, supporting the rebels initially financially, but then with English soldiers. English soldiers were landed in the Netherlands to support them in their revolt. And that was enough. Philip II had had it. Elizabeth was now intervening in what was, in his mind, an internal affair. And so he decided she had to go. The question was, could he find a suitable Roman Catholic monarch to supplant her? And he thought he found that monarch in Mary, Queen of the Scots. Her name was Mary Stuart, and the royal family of Scotland was the Stuart family. keeping in mind that at this time England and Scotland were two separate kingdoms. Mary had also run into her problems with Protestantism. At this time, John Knox, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, had initiated this church in Scotland, and many of Scotland's nobles had converted to the Presbyterian Church, a Protestant church. It had gotten so bad that when Mary refused to sort of recognize the Protestant church, the Presbyterian nobles rebelled against her and removed her as queen. They replaced her with her son James, whom they essentially raised as a Presbyterian. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was Roman Catholic and out of a job. And Philip communicated with her and began to conspire with her so that when Elizabeth was removed from power, Mary, Queen of the Scots, could ascend to the throne of England and rule England as a Roman Catholic, essentially as a protectorate of Spain. Because Philip's plan was to invade England, brush aside England's pitiful little navy, brush aside England's pitiful little army, and capture and execute Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of the Scots. And he began to construct a fleet of ships, warships and troop transport ships, to invade England. This was known as the Armada, or if you prefer, the Spanish Armada. In the meantime, things had gotten a little ugly for Mary, Queen of the Scots. She was not 100% certain that the English people would accept her as their sovereign. Not necessarily because of her Catholicism. She wasn't even sure Roman Catholics in England, or Roman Catholic sympathizers in England, would accept her because she was a foreigner, a Scot. And you have to remember that we think of England and Scotland as the United Kingdom today, but at that time they were two very separate kingdoms. So Mary actually traveled into England to try to gauge the support that she would receive. But while she was there, she was captured and held prisoner by the English. And although there was enormous pressure on Elizabeth to have her executed, Elizabeth resisted and resisted because Mary was her cousin. And they had been friends. And she really held out, but then eventually incontrovertible evidence that she was in conspiracy against Elizabeth was presented to Elizabeth, and she consented to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots was executed in 1587. And a lot of people say, well, that's why the Spanish Armada was built, that Philip was so outraged at the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, that he decided to invade England. It's not the case. The invasion of England was part of the plan from the beginning. Mary, Queen of Scots, could only have become queen with the support of a Spanish invasion. But also in 1587, Sir Francis Drake led a raid on the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada was being constructed in the port of Cadiz, and the raid of Francis Drake was conducted at night. They managed to slip into the harbor by ship, which is an amazing accomplishment, and basically destroyed the Armada as it was being constructed. So things were going from bad to worse for Philip II. But he ordered the reconstruction of the Armada. Now, he was told that it would take over a year to build the fleet to the size that would be needed to invade England. But the idea was also presented that they could convert galleons into troop transport ships and even warships by mounting guns on them. And so, impatient, he said, do that. So the Spanish Armada sailed in 1588, and the plan was for the Armada to pick up Spanish soldiers in the Netherlands and sail across the English Channel. There were over 140 ships in the Armada. England had a navy that numbered fewer than 40 ships, so it should be easy to brush them aside, land Spanish troops in southern England, and defeat the English and accomplish Philip's mission, even though Mary, Queen of Scots, was now dead. But it didn't go that way. The Armada encountered the English navy in the English Channel, and in what's known as the Battle of Gravelines, the Armada was in fact defeated. The problem was that these galleons were so slow and unmaneuverable that they couldn't turn. English ships were smaller and had guns that could fire their projectiles a shorter distance. But the thing was that at a time when you had to turn your ship in order to aim your guns, the English ships could move quickly and turn, and the Spanish ships couldn't, and the English could almost literally sail circles around them. And so even though the Spanish had more guns and bigger guns and more ships, they were defeated. Those who survived attempted to sail northward into the North Sea. The backup plan, such as it was to go into ports in Scotland and land troops in Scotland and march south. But there were bad storms in the North Sea, and so many of the Spanish ships could not go into port, although they needed to desperately, because all of the Scottish ships, fishing ships, commercial ships, warships, they were in port because of the storms. So the Spanish had no choice but to try to sail around the northern tip of Scotland and sail back to Spain that way. Well, it didn't go well for them. Many of them, they didn't understand the currents. They ran aground on the coast of Ireland, and the Spanish Armada was thoroughly defeated, either by the English or by the storms, which the English began to refer to as the Protestant wind, or by navigational failures, things like that. So that brought an end, really, to the efforts by Philip II to overthrow Elizabeth, and she continued to reign for 15 years following her defeat of the Armada. She reigned until 1603, which meant that she oversaw the initial efforts to establish English colonies in the Americas, again named after her, Virginia. That was also a part of her offensive against the Spanish. The Spanish had well-established colonies in Central and South America. The English were now seeking to thwart any efforts by the Spanish to move forward into North America. And so there was a geopolitical goal involved in Elizabeth's support of colonization of North America. Elizabeth also went on the offensive against Roman Catholicism in general. Her father, Henry VIII, when he had converted the English people to the Anglican Church, he had waged war against the presence of the Roman Catholic Church in England. He had shut down all of England's Roman Catholic monasteries. He had confiscated their lands. He had sold off the lands to English nobles. Elizabeth largely continued that effort, expanding it into Ireland, where she suppressed Roman Catholicism there, although Roman Catholicism was very closely tied up with the Irish national identity. Elizabeth oversaw the deportation of thousands of Irish Catholics. So she was quite hostile to Roman Catholicism, and particularly to its chief standard bearer, the Spanish, throughout her reign. Elizabeth died in 1603, having never produced an heir to the throne. And so, the constitutional crisis that Henry VIII hoped to avert, that of having no heir or a female heir, he was not able to avert in any way. England ended up with 2 female monarchs in a row, and it turned out okay. And then, when Elizabeth died, there was no heir to the throne. Her closest living relative was James of Scotland, James Stuart, who was at that time James VI, King of Scotland. Elizabeth had been a cousin to the Stuart family. I mentioned that Mary, Queen of the Scots. James's mother was Elizabeth's cousin. So James was, I don't know, how you do cousins one time removed or whatever, but James was Elizabeth's cousin's son. And as James VI, he ruled over Scotland. He then came to rule over England as well, because he was the heir to the throne. He was the closest blood relative to the dead queen. So he's James VI of Scotland, James I of England, and he ruled England from 1603 to 1625. Now, things were different in England because of Magna Carta. Magna Carta had established the principle that the powers of the king are limited, and it had given a few examples of limits on the power of the king. The king cannot, for example, deprive an English noble of their life or their liberty or their property without some sort of fair and just legal proceeding. The king must obey the law himself. He's not above the law. These are examples of ways that the King of England's power was limited. Well, that was not true of the King of Scotland. The Magna Carta applied only to the King of England. In Scotland, the king ruled as an absolute monarch, as most European monarchs ruled at that time. So James, in terms of his personal history and in terms of his temperament, was used to ruling as an absolute monarch. He was not used to the idea of there being constitutional limits on his power. And philosophically, he also did not believe in limited monarchy. James had authored an essay entitled The True Law of a Free Monarch, in which he had laid out philosophically the basis for a monarch's absolute authority. James, like essentially everybody else in Europe at this time, believed that monarchs ruled by divine right, that they had been chosen by God and ordained by God to rule, that they were God's chosen representative, and that essentially their mission was to carry forth God's will on earth. Well, God, because he's was considered to be omnipotent, could have an unlimited will. There was really nothing that God could not will. So if the king's job was to carry forth God's will on earth, his power also needed to be unlimited, absolute. And so this is what James was writing about in The True Law of a Free Monarch. So philosophically and temperamentally and in terms of his personal history, James did not believe in limited monarchy. But in England, in becoming King of England, he kind of had to learn to accept those limits. Another thing he had to learn to accept was the existence of Parliament. Parliament evolved out of something in Magna Carta, because one of the other terms of Magna Carta was that English nobles could not be taxed without giving their consent. That the king, if he wanted to tax England's nobles, would have to summon them into a great council and explain to them the need for the tax, and then they would consent to being taxed, or not, if they weren't persuaded of the value of it. So, ever since then, this sort of great council of nobles was summoned every time a tax needed to be levied. Now, as England entered into the modern era, and as merchants and bankers and guild masters and so on became more important in society, increasingly important, during the revival of trade following the medieval period, the early modern period, as they became more important to kings, because they were the king's chief source of revenue. The taxing of their trade became his chief source of revenue. As they became more important to kings, kings increasingly wanted to have their voice in on what was going on in these discussions of the so-called Grand Council, because what had happened is the nobles had begun to use their power over the tax to leverage more power from the king. Because what they would do is they would say, okay, we agree to be taxed, but on the following conditions. You must do this, you must do that. And typically these conditions were related to laws that they wanted the king to establish and enforce. And in this way, the Great Council had sort of taken on some of the legislative authority from the king. They used their power over taxes, the power to give consent or not give consent, to leverage legislative lawmaking power from the king. The king now wanted to balance the power of the nobles by introducing the voices of those who were becoming more important to him than the nobles, the merchants, the bankers, the guild masters, and so on. And so he began to invite them to these meetings. And of course the nobles regarded these people as scum. They're sort of common people. And so they refused to meet in the same house as the merchants and the bankers. And so the Grand Council took on two houses. One house being the house of the nobles, the House of Lords, and then the other house being the house of the common people, House of Commons. And so ever since then, that was sort of the evolution of Parliament. It evolves out of an idea from Magna Carta. And by the time James ascended to the throne of England, Parliament was a well-established institution in England. And it was well established that they had some degree of control over lawmaking, legislative power. Well, that was different to James as well. There was no parliament in Scotland. And he upon ascending to the throne of England, he wrote back to a friend in Scotland that England's parliament was just a mess, a body without a head. They squabble, they quarrel. It's an outrage. And he said, I'm astonished that my ancestors would ever agree to this thing. But he said, I'm a stranger here, and as it was here before I got here, I'm simply going to have to learn how to get along. And that was a very prudent, view of the world, and that served James well. And his reign as King of England lasted for 22 years, from 1603 to 1625. And for the most part, with a few exceptions where he initiated some taxes over commerce that maybe members of Parliament weren't very happy about, for the most part, he managed to maintain a pretty decent settlement with Parliament. And of course, it was during James's reign that English colonization in the Americas really first succeeded. The Jamestown colony on the James River in Virginia was England's first successful permanent colony. And James also oversaw the establishment of the authorized edition, English language edition of the Bible, the King James Bible. So it was a time of stability, when it could have been a time of instability. James also did not attempt to impose Roman Catholicism over England, although his family had been Roman Catholic. Now you remember, the nobles of Scotland had essentially raised him as a Presbyterian, but he resented that, and he was a Catholic at heart, as his family was Catholic, and so perhaps he could have come to England and tried to do what Mary, his mother, had tried to do, which is establish Roman Catholicism there. He didn't do that. He didn't mess with Parliament. He didn't mess with the Magna Carta. He didn't mess with any of England's traditional institutions. He didn't mess with the Anglican Church, for the most part. And so things went well. But when he died in 1525, James's son Charles ascended to the throne. And although Charles was young and initially quite popular, his temperament was different from his father's. He shared his father's philosophical conviction that the concept of limited monarchy is ludicrous, that the concept of sharing power with Parliament is ludicrous. He shared that philosophy, he shared that temperament, but he did not share his father's willingness to sort of accept things as they are. He didn't share his father's prudence. And what Charles believed in was that he could establish himself essentially as an absolute monarch in England and in Scotland, which he now ruled jointly. Right? This is the beginning of the concept of the United Kingdom. James and Charles, both of them leading England and Scotland together. Well, Charles also inherited from his father a couple of different things. He inherited some big spending. James, one of the things that did cause him problems with Parliament was his spending. He tended not to deny himself many luxuries. Charles was the same way. And he also inherited ongoing wars with the French and the Spanish, which were expensive. And the thing is that, in England, if you felt the need to increase revenue in order to continue or expand your war effort, you had to go to Parliament. Well, Charles didn't want to go to Parliament to expand its war effort against the Spanish, which was going badly. He didn't want to do that because, number one, he didn't believe he should have to share power with Parliament. He didn't believe he should have to beg them to be taxed. He considered himself to be an absolute monarch. And then additionally, his friend, the Duke of Buckingham, who was in charge of the military efforts of the English, which were failing, he believed would be impeached if he summoned Parliament. And this was the thing. At that time in England, Parliament only met when it was summoned by the king. It didn't meet regularly. And so it only met when the king summoned them to seek consent to raise taxes. So Charles didn't want to summon Parliament because he knew that if he did, probably one of the conditions that Parliament would attach to granting him tax monies, was the removal of his friend from command. So Charles decided to try other means to raise revenue, specifically in the form of forced loans. A forced loan was not a tax, because at least ostensibly it would be paid back someday. But a forced loan was compulsory, and it was made compulsory on England's nobles, as well as on England's merchants and bankers and so forth. The thing was that a forced loan, in the eyes of England's nobles, was at the very least a violation of the spirit of Magna Carta, inasmuch as it really was a tax in their mind. It was a sneaky way of not calling it a tax and therefore not having to summon Parliament. But then, when persons who refused to pay a forced loan, particularly when they were nobles, when they refused to do so, the king authorized that their land be confiscated and that they be imprisoned. Well, that was a violation not only of the spirit of Magna Carta, but of its very words as well, because Magna Carta says that no English noble could be deprived of his liberty or his property without some sort of fair and just legal proceeding, and that was not happening. And so there was great outrage in England against Charles I. And then Charles I ran into another problem, and that is that the forced loans were not generating enough revenue to pay for his luxuries and his war efforts. And so finally in 1629, Charles quite reluctantly relented and summoned Parliament. And Parliament was in a bad mood. They were not going to deny the king the tax monies that he needed because they didn't want England to lose the war. But they were going to insist on certain acknowledgments by Charles of the limits that they believed were on his power. And so they produced a document called the Petition of Right. And the Petition of Right essentially is a restatement of the promises of Magna Carta. For example, that an English person may not be deprived of their liberty or their property without some fair and just legal proceeding, what we in the United States would call due process. Now, that wasn't exactly a restatement of Magna Carta, because Magna Carta only offered those protections to English nobles. Petition of Right expanded those protections to all Englishmen, so commoners as well as nobles. The other thing that Parliament presented to Charles for his signature was the law of habeas corpus, a law which required that English persons could not be simply arbitrarily arrested and held prisoner. There had to be at least some evidence that a crime had been committed, and that the person had to be told what that crime was. You didn't necessarily have to prove that person had committed that crime to detain them, but you had to at least demonstrate that a crime had been committed, that you simply were not making something up. Charles agreed to these, and Parliament then agreed to authorize taxation. But as soon as Parliament then was disbanded, Charles went right back to his old ways. He went right back to issuing forced loans, and he went right back to imprisoning his political opponents and confiscating their property. And from 1629 through 1640, he went right back to ignoring Parliament. He was determined to rule England personally, as it was put. This is known. This 11-year period in which Parliament was never summoned is known as the period of the personal rule, a period in which Charles I intended to rule England without Parliament. How would he generate revenue if he couldn't summon Parliament and have them levy taxes? He came up with creative ways. One of those was through the practice known as ship money. Ship money was a traditional power of the king dating back into the centuries, in which the king was authorized to directly tax counties, communities that were along the coast, in order to pay for improvements to coastal defenses and for the Navy, facilities for the Navy. And the premise at that time was that the coastal communities should pay for that because they were the ones who really benefited from those defenses and from the Navy's efforts. It would protect them from Vikings and pirates and things like that. Charles reasoned that in this era of trade, all communities throughout England ought to pay ship money, because they all really benefited. Because trade was so important in England, they all really benefited from a strong navy and strong coastal defenses. So Charles began issuing ship money. He began collecting ship money from even inland communities, and that was a source of controversy. Although I think that his logic is quite sound, it was clearly seen as another expansion of his power in an effort to subvert Parliament and get around Parliament and collect money without raising taxes. He also spoke to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the leading churchman of England. This is William Laud, Laud, and he asked Laud, is there some way that the church can generate revenue for the crown? And Laud said that there was, that in fact, back in the era of Elizabeth, a law had been passed requiring all of the sovereign's subjects to attend the services of the Church of England, and that any person who did not could be fined. And it was a small fine, but it could be levied every time you failed to attend a service. And so there was a proposal to start levying that fine against persons who refused to attend Anglican services. And this even led Charles to propose a single book of prayer, what would be called a common book of prayer, that would apply to all of his subjects, whether they lived in England or Scotland. And essentially the idea was that any person not attending a service where the Book of Common Prayer was used could be fined. Well, this was an outrage really to two groups. One of those was the Presbyterians in Scotland, because the common book was quite different from the typical Presbyterian style of worship. And then the other one was a group of English dissenters called Puritans. Both Presbyterians and Puritans had been strongly influenced by the philosophies and doctrines of John Calvin. John Calvin believed in predetermination. He also believed that the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church came from its worldliness and its desire for luxury. So in Puritan churches and in Presbyterian churches, there was a great de-emphasis on worldly luxuries. Puritan and Presbyterian churches were plain, no stained glass, no gold candlesticks, no statues, no artwork, no incense. In many cases, not even a steeple or a bell. Simplicity was the thing. Anyway, Puritans then were former members of the Church of England, I guess technically still members of the Church of England, but they regarded the Church of England as being corrupt by the fact that so much of the Roman Catholic traditions were still held there. And so Puritans were seeking to purify the Church of England by getting rid of those corruptions that they felt existed because the church was still too Catholic. So you had Puritans who refused to attend services of the Church of England. You had Presbyterians. And when this law began to be enforced, both groups were angered. But it was the Scots who really rebelled violently. A Scottish army, a Scots Presbyterian army, invaded northern England and captured the city of York. And now Charles I really had a problem on his hands. He's at war with the French, with the Spanish, now at war with the Scots as well. And now he needed to summon Parliament again, because there was no way to generate the kind of revenue that he needed to fight this Puritan rebellion, or this Presbyterian rebellion. He really didn't want to do it. He had ruled England for 11 years without summoning Parliament, and now he had to do it. Needless to say, Parliament was again in quite a bad mood, and before they would even consider the king's requests, several members of Parliament, many members of the House of Commons were Presbyterian, or were Puritans. And rather than even consider the king's requests, they simply lashed out against him for all of his abuses of power, and for days a group of Puritan members of the House of Commons went on railing against the king's abuses. The leader of this group was John Pym, P-Y-M. Finally, Charles had had enough, and he took a group of soldiers with him, and they burst into the House of Commons. They were there with the intention of arresting the Puritans, who were delaying the process of considering the king's request by speaking out against him. They weren't there. They had been informed in advance of the king's coming, and they had escaped. But the real problem with this act was that the House of Commons was considered to be a sacred place where the king could not enter without their consent. And the king had done that. He had intruded into the House of Commons backed by the force of soldiers. And this ignited what became known as the English Civil War. The English Civil War, for all intents and purposes, lasted a little over 6 years, almost 7 years, from 1642 to 1649. The act of the king intruding into the House of Commons was like the final abuse. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, because it showed once more the king's disrespect for his position as a limited monarch, his disrespect for the traditions, the political traditions and institutions of England, his disrespect for Parliament. England divided itself into two sides, essentially, Cavaliers and Roundheads. The Cavaliers were the supporters of the king. They were, for the most part, nobles. They were members of the Anglican Church. They tended to live on country estates because of their status as nobles. The Roundheads, on the other hand, were the supporters of Parliament, specifically the supporters of the House of Commons. Many of them were Puritans, and for the most part, they made their living in trade. They were merchants and bankers and guildmasters and so on, and they really were concentrated in the city of London. As a matter of fact, shortly after his intrusion into the House of Commons, the city of London became unlivable for Charles I. He had to flee to his castles out in the countryside. The Roundheads got their name because, as Puritans, they were against luxury, and at that time one of the chief symbols of luxury was the powdered wig, which was done up in an elaborate hairstyle. The Puritans, by contrast, cut their hair short. You could see the round shape of their heads, so they were referred to as Roundheads. There was really a third side in the English Civil War, and that was the Scots Presbyterians invading from the north. At the beginning of the war, the Cavaliers who supported the king sort of had the advantage, in as much as, since they were nobles, they had experience with leading soldiers. They were experienced military people, experienced horsemen, and that experience tended to give them the advantage at the outset of the war. But in a lot of ways, they were in a very bad strategic position because they had to fight a two-front war. They had to fight the army of Parliament, the parliamentarian army, the Roundhead army, coming up out of London, sort of in the south and east, and they had to fight the Scots Presbyterians coming in from the north. And if the parliamentarians could just get their act together, you would essentially be doomed in that position if you were the Cavaliers. The man who finally got the parliamentarians' act together was Oliver Cromwell. He had been a member of the House of Commons, and he took over the control of the parliamentarian armies, and he formed what he called a new model army, an army that was constructed through conscription, that is to say, through a draft. Cromwell reasoned that a draft actually built morale. You say, well, a draft, you force people to fight who don't want to fight. But on the other side, when you have an army made up only of volunteers, there's the sense that you're doing all the fighting and there are people who are going to benefit from your sacrifices who are not going to bear any of the risk or any of the burden. And so Cromwell reasoned that you'd have better morale in your army if everybody was sort of forced to carry their share of the load. Cromwell also infused his army with religious fervor, and that made it different as well. Another thing that he did was appoint officers and promote officers on the basis of merit, not on the basis of their connections or anything like that. And so he got better quality officers. So in all these ways, the new model army came to be a more modern army, one that could cause real problems for the Cavaliers, and in time the tide of the war turned against the Cavaliers because sort of wedged in between the new model army coming out of London, out of the south, and the Scots Presbyterians, they were fighting a two-front war, and they failed. So in 1649, the Cavaliers were defeated. Charles I became a prisoner of Parliament, and he was ultimately put on trial for treason, and he was executed. Having removed their king, the English now turned to a new form of government, which they called the Commonwealth. That is a type of government which it was believed would look out for the common interest, the interest of everyone, rather than a privileged few. They abolished the monarchy. They abolished the nobility. And so the Commonwealth had a unicameral legislature, one house, the House of Commons. The House of Lords had been abolished. The nobility had been abolished. The feudal system had been abolished. So you only have the House of Commons, and all legislative authority resides in them. Who was the executive? At the moment, nobody. There was a sort of a council of state, so sort of executive by committee, and they were answerable to Parliament, to the House of Commons. There was no single person who served as the executive. Many people acknowledged that Cromwell was sort of a leader, but there was a rebellion in Ireland against the new government, and Cromwell was absent. He took the army to Ireland and waged war, brutal war against the Irish, but he wasn't present in England then. So in the meantime, the House of Commons sort of ruled the Commonwealth, but the House of Commons was smaller than it used to be because Thomas Pride, who was a Puritan, had purged it. This is known as Pride's Purge. Anybody who was not essentially a radical Puritan was purged out of the House of Commons. Many members of the House of Commons had supported the Roundheads in the Civil War against the king, and had done so because they believed that the king had overstepped his boundaries and had overstepped his authority. They didn't necessarily want to turn England into a Puritan paradise. They didn't necessarily support the agenda of the radical Puritans for transforming English society that way. Well, once the war was over, the Puritans wanted that transformation, and anybody who sat in the House of Commons who was opposed to that had to go. And so Thomas Pride, backed by the army, purged, removed from the House of Commons all of those who were opposed to that. And so what you have is a sort of a House of Commons that is stripped of any opposition. It is only populated by those who support the Puritan agenda. This becomes known in history as the Rump Parliament, because it's cut down to the rump. So the Rump Parliament, which ruled the Commonwealth. When Cromwell returned from his campaigns in Ireland, he found that the Rump Parliament was extremely unpopular. Obviously, their agenda was not the same as many English people's agenda. And they had not managed the economy well, and they were very unpopular. And so Cromwell, in an act of political theater, went into the Rump Parliament, which had, in their mind, been acting in his name and under his authority, and he disbanded them. He makes this very dramatic, excoriating speech in which he declares that they have become the source of all of England's problems, and he kicks them all out. And so with that, Parliament ceased to exist. And Cromwell issued what became known as the Instrument of Government, a new constitution for England, and he promised that there would be a new House of Commons and a new executive, the Lord Protector. Cromwell, of course, assumed the position of Lord Protector, and a new House of Commons was elected. But the problem was that the new House of Commons, when elected, was made up of so many members who, again, did not support Cromwell's objectives. So there was a provision in the Instrument of Government that allowed the Lord Protector to disband Parliament under conditions of crisis or rebellion, and Cromwell did that. he disbanded the new parliament and essentially ruled England as a dictator. As Lord Protector, he ruled England as a dictator, a military dictator. He had the army backing him up. He imposed a lot of those terms on England that were designed to transform England into that Puritan paradise. So, a lot of acts which in John Calvin's mind were sinful because they were banned in the Old Testament. So things like card playing and gambling and dancing and music and that kind of thing, public drunkenness, ale houses were shut down, after a certain hour, and that kind of thing. Those sorts of laws were enacted under the Lord Protector's authority. At the same time, Cromwell issued what was at that time probably the most liberal decree on religious toleration and religious freedom in all of Europe. Cromwell essentially said, as long as you obey the laws, as long as you don't get drunk in public or have dance marathons or gamble or that kind of thing, as long as you don't do those things, you may worship however you choose, as long as you're not Catholic. And so, as restrictive as that sounds, that was probably at the time the most liberal stance on religious freedom in the entire continent at that time. Anyway, Cromwell ultimately died in 1660, having ruled the Commonwealth for 7 years, having ruled England as dictator for 7 years. And at that point, there was real concern in England about how to proceed because as a dictator, when you have an absolute monarch, at least you know who the next ruler is supposed to be. In the case of a military dictator, you don't have that. And there was great fear that England would descend back into chaos. Finally, the House of Commons concluded that the best thing that could be done would be to restore the old monarchy. The fact is that a limited monarchy had worked pretty well for England for really from 1215 until 1620 or so, 1629. It had worked for over 400 years. And many believed that the only reason why it had failed was because Charles had been overreaching in his quest for power. So they said, let's go back to the system that worked for us. Let's just make sure that we maintain the limits on the monarch's power, and let's see if this works. So in 1660, the monarchy was restored, and all the old traditional institutions, including the House of Lords and a bicameral parliament, were restored. Charles the First's son, Charles II, who along with his brother James had fled into exile in France during the Civil War, was then invited to come and restore himself to the throne, to restore the Stuart family to the throne. And he did, and he ruled England from 1660 through 1685. His reign was one of great prosperity for the English. It was a time in which England's colonies in the Americas expanded. It was a time in which the trade with England's colonies was managed quite effectively through the policy of mercantilism to bring great wealth to England. Certainly at the expense of the colonies and the colonists. That's how mercantilism works. You arrange trade between the mother country and the colonies in such a way that wealth is transferred from the colonies to the mother country. So it went well for England. It was a time of prosperity. There was only the concern that Charles was Roman Catholic. And although there was a desire to restore the old institutions, there was not a desire to see a Catholic dynasty established in England. And so, when Charles died, childless, and his younger brother James, who would be James II, looked to ascend to the throne in 1685, Parliament convened and essentially issued to James the following ultimatum. They said, we will accept you as the king, but you must baptize your heir as an Anglican. We don't want to establish a Roman Catholic dynasty in England. We want to ensure that the kings of England will be members of the Church of England. And Parliament had passed a series of laws at various times late in the reign of Charles II, the Test Act, which ensured that appointed officials of the government must be Anglicans, and so on, that were designed to ensure that Roman Catholics would not take control of England's government. James agreed. And ascended to the throne in 1685. But then word got out that he had broken his promise to Parliament, that he had produced a son, but that his son had been baptized as a Roman Catholic. And when that news was learned, Parliament concluded that he had to go, and they entered into a conspiracy with William of Orange, who was a Dutchman. All right, so one of the noble families of the Netherlands, and William of Orange had actually married James's daughter, Mary. So he was the son-in-law of James, the King of England, and he was Protestant, and therefore much more desirable to Parliament as their king. He was invited, along with his wife Mary, to invade England and claim the throne. And William and Mary did so in 1688 in what was called the Glorious Revolution. The army that supported William and Mary's claim to England's throne was a multinational army of Protestants. It was made up not only of English Protestants, but also Protestants from, of course, the Netherlands, but also Sweden and Denmark and northern parts of Germany. And together they invaded England. James assembled an army with the intent of resisting this, but as they prepared to meet in battle, in the weeks leading up to it, many of his soldiers defected to the other side. They were Anglicans, and they didn't intend to fight for a Catholic monarch. And so the battle actually never took place, and James, realizing that his army had left him, was forced to concede, and he fled into exile. It didn't last long. James almost immediately began to plot with fellow Catholics to try to overthrow William and Mary. As a matter of fact, he relocated himself to Ireland. James relocated himself to Ireland and began recruiting allies amongst the Irish Catholics. The English had been suppressing Irish Catholicism for centuries now, but it had grown in this suppression had grown in its intensity during Cromwell's campaign, and he had waged essentially total war against the Irish, and so there was an increased desire on the part of Irish Catholics to separate themselves from England. And so James was able to find helpful and willing allies in the Irish and in the French, who, of course, continued to be opponents of the English, and now they were doubly opponents of the English because England was now ruled by a Dutchman. And the French king, Louis XIV, was very interested in expanding France's borders to the north, and in doing so was certain to intrude upon Dutch territory. So the French were interested not only as Catholics and not only as longtime rivals of England, but as a way of getting at the Dutch. And so in 1689, immediately you have the first of what is known as the Jacobite rebellions, or the Jacobite risings. The Jacobite risings were a series of rebellions led by supporters of James and then his later son, James, and his other younger son, Charles. They were supporters of the Stuarts. They were supporters of restoring the Stuarts to power in England. And they take the name the Jacobites. These Jacobite risings often originate out of Ireland or Scotland or France, and they oftentimes have the backing of the French if they don't originate out of France. But the first of these was in 1689. And so this first rebellion against the authority of William and Mary was met by William and Mary with armed force. And it was fought, the battles were fought in Ireland. The most important of these battles was the Battle of the Boyne, which is a river. The Boyne is a river. And in the Battle of the Boyne, the forces of William and Mary defeated the forces of the Jacobites. And for many Irish, they consider that to be a real disaster because having aligned themselves with James and the Jacobites, They'd hoped to gain a friendly government in England, and now instead they will have roused up the anger of the English government again against them, and now the suppression of Irish Catholicism is just going to get worse. So in the Battle of the Boyne, 1689, William and Mary's forces defeated the Jacobites, but there will be Jacobite risings throughout the end of the 17th century and throughout the first half of the 18th century. The last of the Jacobite risings would take place in 1746. The earliest Jacobite risings sought to restore James II, to the throne of England. Later Jacobite risings will seek to bring to the throne of England his son James or his younger son Charles. Because of this, James II is known in English history as the Old Pretender, the pretender to the throne, somebody who believes he should be king but won't be king. So James II is known as the Old Pretender. His son James is known as the Young Pretender, and then his youngest son Charles is known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. But anyway, also in 1689, having suppressed the rebellions in Ireland, William and Mary agreed to two limits on their power. One of these is known as the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is it's a restatement of the promises made in Petition of Right, a guarantee of property rights and the rights to what we call due process here in the United States. But it expanded the rights of the English people to include protection against unfair legal practices, such as my brain's not working right. Harsh, cruel and unusual punishments, excessive bails, things like that. It also guaranteed freedom of political speech. The English Bill of Rights also initiated the process of having regular parliaments. This was agreed to by William and Mary. Additionally, the Act of Toleration was presented to William and Mary. The Act of Toleration was an even more liberal guarantee of religious freedom of worship than Cromwell had, because the Act of Toleration essentially allowed any person to worship in any way they chose in England. The only exception to that being the monarch. The monarch was the only person who did not have the freedom to worship as he or she chose, but rather had to be an Anglican. So William and Mary, their reign was regarded as a period in which the rights of Englishmen were greatly expanded. William and Mary are celebrated as having come into power as a result of the Glorious Revolution, an essentially bloodless revolution that assured the power of Parliament and made Parliament even stronger by having it meet regularly and not meet only at the will of the king, and a revolution which produced more individual rights for the English people. William and Mary ruled as joint monarchs, that is to say they were both empowered with sovereign power. Mary was Queen of England not simply as the king's wife, but as a sovereign in her own right. And when Mary died in 1694, William continued to reign as King of England until 1702, when he died as well. But they had produced no children. And so at that point, it was Mary's younger sister, Anne, who ascended to the throne of England. She did not rule for very long, only from 1702 through 1707. And she had 13 children, none of whom survived. She outlived all of her children, and so was a very tragic figure. But during her reign, the War of Spanish Succession began. And the War of Spanish Succession was brought forward because of the desire of France's king, Louis XIV, mentioned him earlier, to expand French control into Spain. The opportunity arose when the Habsburg line ended in Spain. But really, this was another power grab by Louis XIV. He was attempting to expand France's borders north into the Netherlands. He was now attempting to expand France south into Spain. And this was alarming to the other countries of Europe. It seemed that if France could achieve this, it would become what's known as a hegemon, a country which is so powerful that it overwhelms its neighbors. and a country who simply by the sheer dominance, their sheer dominance, is a threat to the security of their neighbors. And as a result of this, you get what's called a balance of power response. The smaller, weaker neighbors will not allow themselves to become dominated by a hegemon, and instead what they will do is they will band themselves together in an alliance with the idea that if they do that, if they all join forces, they can bring the power back into balance, and they'll make war on the country that appears poised to become a hegemon. They'll make war on that country to try to weaken it and together bring the power back into balance. This is what happened with the War of Spanish Succession. Ever since the time of William and Mary, the English had come to regard themselves as an essential part of this balance of power. Because England sat sort of on an island, they are on an island, they could sort of choose what European affairs to be involved with. If wars broke out on the continent and they didn't want to be involved, they could sort of easily avoid being involved. On the other hand, if they chose to be involved, they could be. And so, from the English perspective, they could either jump in with an alliance that was forming to try to balance power against a growing hegemon or not. And so the English sort of saw it as their role to make that decision, whether they were going to play the role of helping to bring power back into balance or sitting back and not letting that happen. So when France began to grow in power, clearly the English, because they have that connection to the Dutch, they were concerned about France's expansion northward. But in general, they chose to join in the alliance that was forming up against the French. It was a continuation of the French-English rivalry, but it also had to do with the English view that they were better off if no single country dominated the continent. And so they enter into this. And in fact, they were the leaders of the Grand Alliance, which formed to fight the French. The military leader of the Grand Alliance was John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, whose ancestor Winston Churchill also ruled England as Prime Minister during a time when a hegemon, Nazi Germany, seemed to be poised to dominate Europe. But anyway, under Churchill's leadership, the Grand Alliance was successful in defeating the French and the Spanish, the combined forces of France and Spain. And in the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, the War of Spanish Succession came to an end. At that time, then, England was poised to begin to pivot from focusing on its internal affairs to focusing increasingly on external affairs. England had been building colonies. By 1713, at the Treaty of Utrecht, England had been building colonies in the Americas for over 100 years, and now they were also beginning to point outward into Asia as well. All of this commercial expansion had really been made possible by the advent in the 17th century of the joint stock company. This was a way of spreading out risk, because the reality is that commercial ventures were very high cost and very high risk. There was no guarantee that you were going to make a profit out of them. And so most people, even wealthy people, were not willing to invest enough to make a commercial venture happen because of the possibility that they would walk away with nothing. So the joint stock company was a way of raising money to start a commercial venture by asking several people to be co-owners, essentially, of a corporation. And the earliest joint stock companies that were established were the Virginia Company and the East India Company. And the Virginia Company was dedicated to extracting and exporting raw materials from America, and the East India Company from India. And it's interesting that in time, the way that these joint stock companies worked was that as the company began to make a profit, then those who had invested in the company, those who had bought shares in the company at the beginning, would receive a portion of the profit called a dividend. And eventually what happened was the shares themselves became valuable. A company that appeared to stand to be profitable, those shares, if you had purchased them, you could then sell those shares at a higher cost or at a higher price than what you bought them for. And so the business of buying and selling shares of stock actually became a business in and of itself, carried on through the Royal Exchange. Now, originally, the persons who were buying and selling stock, who were known as stock jobbers, people who could find you the stock you wanted to buy, or people who could take the stock that you wanted to sell and find people who wanted to buy it for you, stock jobbers. They were working out of the Bank of England, but they were too boisterous, and so they get kicked out. And for a time, they were doing most of their work out of coffee shops, such as Jonathan's Coffee Shop. But eventually, a Royal Exchange was established for specifically for the buying and selling of stocks. Now, this brings us around to the sort of political situation in France, or in England at this time, because this whole new world of making money through commerce and banking and even manufacturing and the buying and selling of stocks, what this meant was that you had a class of people, a middle class, who were increasingly wealthy and increasingly influential in society. As a matter of fact, it had gotten to the point where you really couldn't tell the difference, almost outwardly, between a member of the nobility and a member of the middle class. Members of the middle class had gotten so wealthy that they could now afford to purchase the luxurious clothing that nobles had once been exclusively wearing. Members of the middle class were buying country estates and setting themselves up like nobles. And then on the other side, nobles now who would have, before a few decades, a few generations before this, have looked down their nose at activities like commerce, were now realizing the enormous money that could be made and how they were being left behind because they were refusing to get involved in this. So it began to happen that the two classes began to merge to some degree to form what was simply known as the gentry, the sort of wealthy class. But even within the gentry, there were divisions, and those divisions tended to be political. And this is when you began to see two political parties emerging in England, the Tories and the Whigs. So the Tories, these were the ones who believed that absolute monarchy was the wisest course for England. They hoped for the return of the Stuarts. They hoped for the restoration of the Stuarts again. They liked the fact that the Stuarts could reign in their own right because they had inherited the throne, and therefore they didn't rely on Parliament, sort of an invitation from Parliament or parliamentary consent to do their job as king. On the other hand, you have the Whigs, and the Whigs were people who believed that Parliament ought to be an effective check on the power of the king. They believed in limited monarchy. And they preferred to have foreigners like William and Mary or Anne or the Georges who are about to come up, the House of Hanover. They preferred to have them as kings because, as foreigners, they were invited to their positions by Parliament, therefore Parliament had more control over them. So the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories tended to be, they were sort of the party of the nobles. The Whigs tended to be the party of the middle class. And so that's where you saw them differ. Sort of socially, culturally, they were merging, but politically, they remained separate from each other. The Tories tended to be associated with the Jacobite risings. They tended to support the Jacobite risings because they supported the return of the House of Stuart. The last of the Jacobite risings was finally defeated in 1746, and with its defeat, the Tories were really sort of out of luck because they had chosen that side, and now that side had been completely defeated. All throughout the first half of the 18th century, though, the Tories were sort of a suspect political party because by this time, William and Mary, Queen Anne, and then the House of Hanover had been well established. The House of Hanover ascended to the throne of England in 1707 with the death of Queen Anne. She had died, as we mentioned, having outlived all of her children, so she died with no heir. Her closest living relative were her German cousins of the House of Hanover. And so now you have a sequence of kings who are the Hanoverian kings, and they're all named George. George the First, George the Second, George the Third, George the Fourth, and they're going to reign from 1707 right up into the 19th century. So the Georges, they were the favorites of the Whigs, and the Whigs and the Georges established, House of Hanover established a sort of very cozy partnership with each other. In some ways too cozy, as you'll eventually see. One of the things that happened was this. The Tories, because they were supporters of the Jacobites and supporters of the return of the House of Stuart, were seen by everybody else as sort of traitors, duplicitous, dangerous, that kind of thing. And because the Jacobite risings were continually defeated, they also came to sort of be seen as losers. So it's hard enough to be a traitor, but be a traitor and a loser, and you're really going to lose any sort of credibility politically that you might have otherwise had. So the Tories were not very politically credible. The Whigs were dominant. They had their partnership with the Georges, with the House of Hanover. They worked together. The Whigs tended to dominate the House of Commons, and working with the Georges sort of gave the Whigs what they wanted, which is like the Georges would nominate their sons to positions in government, so there was patronage there. The Georges, the House of Hanover had position to dispense, and the members of the House of Commons who were, and even to the extent that they were there, the House of Lords, who were Whigs, were happy to have that for their sons, positions for their sons, position in government, things like that. The thing was that meant that politics became very non-competitive. It became an era of Whig dominance in which the Tories were so discredited that there was no hope for them of ever regaining a majority in the House of Commons. And, competition is what helps to keep politics and politicians accountable. The fear that if you don't do your job well, they might pick somebody else in a democracy is part of what keeps them doing the people's work. And what began to happen was the Whigs were so satisfied and so comfortable that they stopped doing the people's work. They showed up in Parliament primarily to pursue their own interests and to get things for themselves and their families. They regarded governing almost as a nuisance. And in this environment, you tend to get laziness and you tend to get corruption. And this corruption manifests itself in what was known as the South Sea Bubble Crisis, which is 1720, 1721. The South Sea Company was a joint stock company which proposed to open up trade with the islands in the South Sea, sort of Indonesia, that area. And they grossly overinflated their expectations for profits in order to drive up the initial values of their stocks, in order to sell their stocks. They also bribed members of Parliament to support their charter, because at this time, all joint stock companies had to be chartered, officially chartered by Parliament. Well, anybody who looked at the South Sea Company's projections would have known that they were unrealistic, and therefore maybe would not have voted to charter the company. But through bribery, they managed to get themselves chartered. There was only really one member of the House of Commons who spoke out loudly against this. This was a guy named Robert Walpole. Well, they were defeated, or he was defeated, and the South Sea Company got its charter. They immediately released they made their initial public offering of stocks at a very high value. And after that, even after that, because of the huge projections that they had made for profits, the secondary markets and the exchanges and the coffee houses, the value of their stock climbed out of proportion to what it should have. And it gave rise to a general enthusiasm for buying and selling stocks. And people began to issue stocks without a charter for companies that had all sorts of dubious purposes. And things got a little crazy. Everybody was trying to buy stock. And because everybody was trying to buy stock, the values of stock certificates climbed sort of unnaturally, artificially high. It's like a bubble, which is growing, and bubbles eventually burst. And this bubble burst when the South Sea Company issued its first dividend, which was what you receive when you're a stockholder. You receive a share of the profit. They made their first profit. They issued their first dividend. It was much lower than the projections. And now people realized that they had bought these stocks. They had been sort of conned into buying these stocks. Now they wanted to sell them. And now with everybody going the other direction, everybody wants to sell. There's no demand for the stocks, and their prices collapse. And people who had borrowed money to buy stocks can't sell them to get the money back, and they're ruined, and nobles were ruined because they had mortgaged their properties to buy stocks. It was almost disastrous, and it almost got the Whigs kicked out of power. But King George nominated Robert Walpole, a man who was known to be trustworthy, a man who had sort of foreseen all of this, to serve as England's first prime minister. Some of these guys understood, that as king, although ultimately executive power runs through you, you sometimes need to appoint somebody who's smarter than you are and a better leader than you are, and that's what Robert Walpole's job is. Prime minister. The king had always had ministers, advisors. This guy will be the prime minister, and then he will be empowered to select his own cabinet, his own group of advisors and secondary ministers, and their job is to run the government, and in this case, save the government. And they did. They managed to get a law passed called the Bubble Act that would sort of reform stocks. It required all joint stock companies to have a charter. That wouldn't have saved the South Sea people, but the South Sea investors, but certainly all those others who invested in these sort of wildcat companies that had cropped up. More importantly, Robert Walpole found an alternative way to pay Britain's debt, and part of it involved a significant reduction of spending, government spending, especially on the military. Robert Walpole's policy was to take the enviable position that Britain had on an island and enjoy a condition which the British came to call splendid isolation, the ability to not get involved. After several decades of involvement and fighting the French and thwarting the purposes of Louis XIV, now Britain would not get involved. They would shrink down the size of their navy, shrink down the size of their army, and enjoy the dividends, enjoy the financial benefits of not having to invest so much in the military. The problem with that was that many people regarded that as a sort of a shameful act. There were people who believed that Britain should be involved and should be out expanding its empire and throwing its naval might around. And these people sensed in Walpole's foreign policy of isolation, they sensed an opportunity to defeat him. He ruled as prime minister for 21 years, and the Whigs maintained their dominance during that period, but not all Whigs were happy with Walpole. He had his enemies, and they sensed that the issue of foreign policy and the sort of shameful role of Britain, now playing this very reduced role in Europe, they could leverage that to defeat him. And as a matter of fact, they did. There were a group of people called the Patriots, a group of politicians called the Patriots, who took an incident and stirred up a war, basically. The roles, by the 18th century, the roles of Spain and England had reversed. England now had this great commercial empire that they were trading with in the Americas, and Spain became sort of the pirates. They were the ones now who were raiding English ships coming back from the Americas. And it was on this basis that the Patriots, the enemies of Robert Walpole, sought to bring him down because they wanted to provoke a war with Spain over this, and Walpole was resisting that, essentially saying this isn't worth it. But they produced the ear. They produced a British captain, commercial captain named Captain Jenkins, and he was carrying around his ear in a jar. It had been cut off, he said, in a fight with Spanish when they raided his ship. And they used his story to stir the British people up into a sort of a war frenzy. And when Robert Walpole failed to deliver the war effort and essentially continued to resist that, he saw his ground in Parliament give way, and eventually he was forced to resign. But what's interesting is that the war between England and Spain, which became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, was contemporaneous. It happened at the same time with the War of Austrian Succession. And ultimately those two wars merged into one. This was a period in which monarchies fought wars over territory. And because the political goals of the monarchs was so limited and specific to the gain of territory, it's not that the civilian populations regarded these wars as being very important to them. Military theorist Karl von Clausewitz talks about how the political goal of a war is inextricably tied with the conduct of the war. That if the nation does not perceive the political goal to be extremely important, something in which they have a very large stake, they won't be willing to support the war effort for a total war. You have to fight with a very limited. You have to fight what's called a limited war with a professional army, and not getting the civilians involved very much. And that's what these wars were sort of about. And the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1648, which brought an end to the War of Austrian Succession / the War of Jenkins' Ear, was a good example of that. Essentially, no land changed hands. Now, it's interesting to note that the British had actually captured, with the help of their American colonists, had actually captured a French fortress called Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. The French, meanwhile, had captured a British fortress in India called Madras. The British had begun trade with India, and the French were challenging them for it. But in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, they simply traded those back to each other. And it sort of goes to show what a fruitless war it really was. But it points out how the English, in trying to expand their trade into India, and the French, in following up on that, were taking their rivalry and moving it into North America, into India, out onto the high seas. It was no longer just about Normandy and territories in France. But the issue of both North America and India eventually led England and France to war again in what was called the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, although fought as well in the continent of Europe, was in a lot of ways, it was about the control of commercial empires. And it very much focused on North America. The French had established their colonies in what is really today Canada and working its way into the interior, the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley. That was French territory, whereas the British colonies were located largely on the coast. And the fighting between the French and the British in North America had really been going on for about 4 years before war was formally declared in 1756. And at first, the French were doing very, very well. And everywhere they fought the British in North America, the French were winning. Well, in 1758, William Pitt took over the prime ministership and took over the war effort. And he really shook things up. Number one, he said, this war is primarily about who's going to control North America. So he doubled the number of British soldiers committed to fighting in North America. He shook up the British Army leadership by appointing officers on the basis of merit, following sort of the Cromwell model, instead of on the basis of who their connections were. A lot of well-connected guys got passed over, and William Pitt made a lot of enemies that way. He also forged an alliance with Prussia. Now, Prussia had been the enemy in the previous war, the War of Austrian Succession. They had been Britain's enemy. Now he forged an alliance with them, and what that meant was that the French, trying to fight the British for control of North America, and with the British ramping up that war effort, the French would also have to fight against Frederick the Great and the Prussians. So the French are fighting sort of a two-front war, if you want to think of it that way. And from that point on, the tide of war turned, and eventually the French were defeated. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, what you have is you have France being forced to concede essentially all of its possessions in North America to the British. It did not, however, solve the situation in India. The British were well established on the west coast of India. The French were more well established on the east coast of India, and both conducting trade. It was the next war, really, that finally began to resolve that conflict. The next war was actually the War of American Independence, and it had nothing to do with a French-British rivalry. It was simply that in their effort to pay for the war effort from the 7 Years' War, which is the war that they had just concluded, the 7 Years' War, the British had sought to increase taxes on their American colonists. American colonists were opposed to that. They were particularly opposed to having taxes levied by Parliament directly on them rather than through their colonial assemblies. They rebelled, and the British and their American colonists were at war. The American colonists managed to persuade the French to join them in an alliance. This is where the British-French rivalry comes back into it. And French support for the Americans helped them to win the war. But it's interesting to note that after the Battle of Yorktown, in which the British war effort against their American colonists essentially came to an end, there was still ongoing fighting, out on the high seas and in India. At the Battle of the Saints, a naval battle, the British defeated the French. And then in India, the last battle of the War of American Independence was actually fought in India. And what's interesting to note is that the French helped to turn that war from a struggle between the American colonists and the mother country into a global war in which everything potentially was on the table. The British were willing to cut their losses with their colonists, hoping to get them back someday and fight the French everywhere else. And in doing so, they won. The British won all the other parts of the War of American Independence. They beat the French on the high seas, they beat the French in India, and really that was the point at which the French were forced to sort of give up on India. And Britain, although they lost their 13 American colonies, established their dominance in India. But it wasn't long the British could sort of bask in the glory of this loss and followed by victory because of the French. The French Revolution had broken out, and the British were at war with the French government again, particularly after the French government was taken over by Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon understood that Britain was a mortal enemy of France, and actually, before he even took over control of France, he had attempted to strike at British possessions elsewhere, specifically in Egypt. The British were beginning to forge a world-dominating textile industry. They were receiving supplies of cotton from their colonies in the Americas and or their former colonies in the Americas, cotton from India, cotton from Egypt. And rather than trying to take on the British directly, Napoleon said, quoting John Adams, the British are a nation of shopkeepers. And he sought to strike at their sources of income. So in his Egyptian campaign, he felt that one of the best ways he could strike at Britain was to strike at their trade network. And so he did. Now, the Egyptian campaign did not go well for him. He was defeated at the Battle of the Nile by the British fleet led by Horatio Nelson. It was a disaster for him. He had not managed his naval resources well, and it did not bring an abrupt end to his campaign in the East, but it essentially spelled disaster for that campaign. He barely makes it back, and luckily for him, the French government was so unpopular at that time that he was able to stage a coup d'etat and establish himself along with his co-conspirators as a consulate, sort of a three-way dictatorship. Now, he eventually parlayed that three-way dictatorship into a one-man dictatorship. And he tried again with the British, and once again, it's Navy that causes this problem. It's Horatio Nelson. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, a British fleet under the command of Horatio Nelson defeated the combined forces of France and Spain. And Napoleon had hoped that by defeating the British fleet, he could open the door to an invasion of Britain, but that door instead got slammed in his face. So twice the British Navy thwarted Napoleon's designs. So Napoleon at that point concluded that his only hope to defeat the British was to, again, wage economic war against them. And he issued what became known as the Berlin and Milan decrees, which were two decrees in which he ordered, first of all of the countries that were in alliance with him, and then all neutral countries not to trade with the British. This was the beginning of what became known as his continental system. And the intent here was not to try to squeeze the British and deny them raw materials. He knew he couldn't do that. Their trade network was too vast. But he concluded that the British economy was so dependent on the selling of goods, again, a nation of shopkeepers. The British economy was so dependent on commerce, the selling of goods, that by having all of those countries refuse to purchase goods from the British, he could deny the British a market and destroy the British economy and defeat them in that way. It never really played out in that way, and instead he ends up fighting the British army. He couldn't defeat the British Navy. He ends up fighting the British army. First of all, he fights them in the Iberian Peninsula because Portugal, of all countries, defied the continental system. They're a longtime ally of the British, and they continued to trade with the British despite the Berlin and Milan decrees. Napoleon, outraged by this, didn't want to allow any small country to defy him, so he marched French forces through Spain on their way to crush the Portuguese. Well, the Spanish did not take well to that. They regarded the French as essentially atheists. The Spanish, on the other hand, were traditional Roman Catholics, and so the Spanish people rose up against him as his armies marched through. He ordered the Spanish king to suppress his people. The Spanish king was neither willing nor able. And so, Napoleon ousted the Spanish king, put his brother, Joseph, on the throne of Spain. That just made things worse. Suddenly, Napoleon was fully embroiled in what became known as the Peninsular War. the British saw how effectively the Spanish engaged in guerrilla warfare against Napoleon, and they sent troops under the Duke of Wellington to the peninsula to help fight Napoleon there. This peninsular war, including the British role in it, was part of what broke Napoleon's back because it forced him to spread his military resources so thinly. And in the end, of course, Napoleon was defeated. He invaded, Russia, and that really was the other straw that broke the camel's back. He did come back briefly to return from exile to rule France for 100 days. And of course, at the end of that 100 days was the Battle of Waterloo, a battle in which once again he finds himself pitted against the Duke of Wellington and the British soldiers there. He had designs on a sort of a diversionary attack and then a main assault directly into the heart of the British lines. He hoped that his diversionary attack would draw British forces away from their center. And although he was somewhat successful in doing that, the diversionary attack, led by one of his other little brothers, Jerome, took on a life of its own. And what happened was French forces were also drawn away from the center of the battlefield toward the diversion. And so when the major assault was finally made against the heart of the British line, it wasn't as strong as it was supposed to be, and the British sort of stood them up, and the fighting raged back and forth until the late afternoon when Prussian cavalry entered the field and sort of sweep the French off. So Horatio Nelson in two battles defeated Napoleon. Two naval battles defeated Napoleon, the Battle of the Nile, the Battle of Trafalgar, and then Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, defeated him in the Peninsular War, and then at the Battle of Waterloo. The British sort of became the wardens of Napoleon during his second exile. His first exile was to the island of Elba. He escaped. So in his second exile, he was placed as the guest of the British government on the island of St. Helena, which is out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and from there he never escaped. Instead, the British joined all of the other victorious countries at the Congress of Vienna, in which they began to work together to forge a vision of what Europe should look like. Napoleon had gone through Europe and had brought a lot of reform, a lot of change, revolutionary change. Now the monarchs looked to sort of turn back the clock and restore Europe to the stability that it had seen before the French Revolution. The British, of course, played a huge role in that, and so that sort of brings an end to their rivalry with the French. During the 19th century, there will be cause for rivalry with the French, but certainly during the 20th century, the British and the French find that they have more in common than more to bicker about. So that'll be the end of this review session.